The illusion of invincibility. For decades, America believed it could not be hurt. Not really, not deeply, not in a way that would scar the nation's soul. It had defeated fascism, it had crushed empires, it had rebuilt Europe, outpaced the Soviets, landed men in space, and shaped the post-war world in its own image. To the generation that grew up after 1945, America was not just a country, it was the country, the one whose power had no equal, whose intentions were righteous, whose victories felt inevitable. Vietnam entered the picture as a distant conflict, an unstable corner of Southeast Asia where communism threatened to spread. But to Washington, this wasn't a crisis, it was a test. And America, the global superpower, would pass it easily. Presidents spoke with calm assurance, generals promised measured escalation. Advisors insisted that a nation backed by the world's strongest military could not lose to a backward region fighting with rifles, sandals, and homemade explosives. They believed technology would triumph over terrain, training would triumph over guerrilla tactics, and firepower would triumph over will. It was an illusion built on past victories, a misunderstanding of the conflict, a misreading of history, and a catastrophic underestimation of an enemy who had survived Chinese dynasties, Japanese occupation, and French colonial armies long before an American soldier ever stepped foot in the rice paddies. The first U.S. troops arrived in 1965 with clean uniforms, polished boots, and confidence radiating from their youth. They did not know they were stepping into a place designed by nature and by men to break them. They did not know that every trail was watched, every tree could hide a rifle barrel, every villager could be an enemy by night, every calm moment a trap. America believed it was entering another war of strength. Vietnam would prove it was entering a war of endurance. What America saw as a mission, Vietnam saw as survival. What America saw as strategy, Vietnam saw as destiny. And what America thought would be a brief intervention would soon become the longest, most divisive conflict in its history. This was the illusion that shattered everything. The belief that power alone protects a nation from pain. America would soon learn that even superpowers bleed, and sometimes they bleed from within. The war no one understood. Before the first firefight, before the first ambush, before the first body bag, there was confusion, deep, disorienting confusion. For America, Vietnam made no sense. There were no front lines, no territories to hold, no cities whose capture would signal victory, no generals to surrender, no flags to raise, just an enemy who blended into the population by day and struck like a ghost at night. American troops expected a conventional war, uniforms, bases, clear distinctions between soldier and civilian. Instead, they found a shifting landscape where a farmer could be a fighter, where a woman carrying rice could also be carrying ammunition, where a village that greeted soldiers with smiles could send them into an ambush hours later. The enemy didn't behave properly. They didn't stand and fight. They didn't retreat logically. They didn't surrender in defeat. They simply vanished, into the jungle, into the rivers, into the tunnels carved beneath the earth like arteries. While American soldiers patrolled above ground, entire Viet Cong battalions slept below them, hidden in labyrinths so intricate they held hospitals, workshops, supply rooms, kitchens, whole underground worlds untouched by bombs. America had never fought an enemy who didn't care about body counts, who accepted death as a cost of freedom, who believed time was a weapon greater than firepower. And there was another problem. Even in Washington, no one could fully explain why America was in Vietnam: to fight communism, to protect democracy, to maintain credibility, to avoid losing face. Different leaders gave different answers. None matched what soldiers saw on the ground. As the war dragged on, American troops began to realize a truth more devastating than enemy fire. They were fighting in a world where victory had no definition and failure had no alternative. A soldier could kill 10 enemies, 20, 50, and it changed nothing. A hill could be taken at sunrise, abandoned at sunset. A village pacified today could be hostile tomorrow. Every gain evaporated, every sacrifice dissolved, every death felt meaningless. And this confusion, this disorientation, not the bullets, not the traps, not the jungle, was the first wound America never recovered from. The jungle that consumed men. Vietnam was not a battlefield. It was a maze designed by nature to break the mind before it broke the body. A humid, tangled, choking world where every step was a guess, and every guess could be your last. American soldiers quickly learned that the jungle was not neutral terrain. It was an enemy, patient, silent, merciless. The air itself felt hostile, thick, wet, heavy. It clung to skin, soaked uniforms, rusted rifles, and made every breath feel borrowed. Men marched miles each day with their shirts pasted to their backs, boots rotting from the inside, socks wet for weeks. Insects were constant. Mosquitoes carried malaria. Leeches slid into boots and onto skin. Ants swarmed injuries. Fungal infections ate at feet and hands. Some soldiers joked they were being devoured alive, and it was only half a joke. But the jungle's greatest weapon wasn't its creatures. It was its silence. A silence so deep it swallowed footsteps. A silence that made soldiers whisper without realizing it. A silence shattered instantly by a mine, an ambush, a burst of gunfire that felt like the world exploding in your chest. Every tree was a hiding place, every bush a possible sniper, every rice paddy a potential trap. The Viet Cong moved through this world like shadows, slipping between leaves, crossing rivers silently, wearing camouflage made from the land itself. American soldiers had maps. The Viet Cong had memory. They knew the rivers, the soil, the routes, the tunnels. They could fight a full battle and disappear before U.S. forces even understood what direction the fire came from. Then came the monsoons. Rain fell in sheets, turning paths into rivers and rivers into brown floods. Men slipped in the mud, lost gear, lost weapons, lost their footing. Helicopters couldn't fly, soldiers couldn't see. Ambushes became nightmares. Battles fought in water up to the thighs with enemies just silhouettes in the downpour. Firefights were chaotic, violent, and short. Minutes of terror followed by hours of searching bodies and treating wounds under a canopy that blocked out the sun. The jungle didn't care about rank, courage, or strategy. It consumed all equally, and the more time soldiers spent in it, the more it changed them. Sleep became shallow. Paranoia replaced caution. Every rustle sounded like a tripwire. Every shadow felt alive. The jungle didn't just break the body, it broke the mind, slowly, quietly, relentlessly. And long after the war ended, many veterans said the same thing. The jungle never left us. It came home with us. The numbers that lied to a nation. While soldiers fought in mud and fear, Washington fought with numbers. Clean, neat, reassuring numbers printed on charts and presented in polished conference rooms, far from the smell of gunpowder and blood. The United States measured progress in Vietnam using the simplest metric they could find: body counts. Every day, officers recorded how many enemy fighters were killed. Every week, generals reported rising totals. Every month, press briefings announced the same message: we are winning. The public, watching televised battles and seeing casualty tallies scroll across the screen, believed these numbers meant something, but they didn't. The body count system was fundamentally broken. It rewarded killing, not strategy. It encouraged commanders to inflate numbers, to label civilians as enemy fighters, to measure success by corpses rather than control. Entire operations were declared victories because the enemy suffered more losses, even though the villages were not secured, the positions not held, and the same territory would need to be fought for again days later. And the Viet Cong? They never counted bodies. They didn't measure loss in numbers. They measured it in resolve. For every fighter killed, 2 more took his place. For every village destroyed, hatred toward America intensified. Every bomb dropped fertilized the ground with anger. Every airstrike produced new recruits determined to outlast the foreign power on their soil. In Washington, numerical victories hid strategic failures. Graphs showed progress. Reality showed chaos. The metrics gave politicians confidence. They gave soldiers despair. A platoon could lose 5 men, kill 20, and be told they had achieved success, even though they were no closer to winning the war. A hill captured at dawn might be abandoned by dusk, only to be captured again a week later and labeled another gain. It was a war measured on paper, not in truth, and when the Pentagon Papers revealed years later that leaders knew the numbers were meaningless, America felt betrayed, not just by a war, but by a system that had lied to maintain the illusion of progress. Numbers didn't win Vietnam. Numbers didn't explain Vietnam. Numbers only prolonged it, and the cost of that lie was measured not in statistics, but in human lives. The sky that burned, but never won. America believed the sky would save it. After all, air power had ended World War II. It had crushed factories, destroyed cities, and forced empires to their knees. So when Vietnam refused to break, Washington turned to the same weapon: fire from above. Operation Rolling Thunder began in March 1965, a sustained bombing campaign designed to intimidate, overwhelm, and cripple the North Vietnamese war machine. In theory, it was unstoppable. Hundreds of jets, millions of tons of explosives, napalm, cluster bombs, artillery strikes, phosphorus streaking across the sky. An industrial superpower, raining destruction on a developing nation. But Vietnam absorbed the blows like a forest absorbs thunder, violently, but without surrender. American pilots flew through monsoon clouds, anti-aircraft fire, and mountains that rose suddenly out of the mist. They watched villages ignite like dry grass. They watched orange fire crawl across treetops. They watched roads, bridges, and supply lines vanish into smoke. And yet the enemy continued to fight. Every bridge destroyed was rebuilt by morning. Every crater became a hiding place. Every burned village became another reason to resist. The Vietnamese did not depend on factories. They depended on will, and will cannot be bombed. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, the vital artery of the North, became a symbol of American impotence. Despite constant bombings, it survived. It twisted through Laos and Cambodia, through jungles too dense to penetrate, through a landscape that changed and adapted like a living organism. The more America bombed, the more the North dispersed. Supplies moved at night. Factories were hidden underground. Weapons were stored in tunnels beneath mountains. The war dissolved into the earth itself, becoming untouchable by the gods of the sky. Then came napalm, fire that clung to skin, fire that screamed, fire that became synonymous with the war's darkest moments. Pilots dropped it believing they were targeting fighters, but the images that returned home showed children running from flames, images that shattered America's moral certainty. For the first time, Americans questioned not the enemy, but themselves. Air power was supposed to win the war. Instead, it ignited the home front. It turned global opinion against the US. It made the world wonder how a superpower could lose its soul trying to win a conflict it didn't understand. Bombs could destroy everything except the one thing America needed most: victory. The sky burned for years, but the ground remained unconquered. The country that turned against itself. As bombs fell in Vietnam, another kind of explosion erupted at home, one that tore through American cities, campuses, families, and identities. For the first time in US history, the home front became a battlefield. Television brought the war into living rooms. Children watched helicopters land in rice paddies while their parents argued nearby. Nightly news showed flames, body bags, screaming civilians, and soldiers too exhausted to lift their rifles. The distance between Vietnam and America collapsed, and with it, the illusion of national unity. Protests surged across college campuses. Students rejected the draft, burned their draft cards on courthouse steps, chained themselves to recruitment centers. They shouted slogans that no one imagined would ever be shouted in America. Stop the war. Bring them home. Hell no, we won't go. Some protests were peaceful. Others ended in violence. Most tragically at Kent State University, where National Guardsmen opened fire on unarmed students, killing 4. The nation gasped. Something fundamental had broken. Families became divided by politics and fear. Fathers who fought in World War II could not understand why their sons were protesting the next war. Sons could not understand why their fathers defended a conflict that made no sense. Friendships ended. Communities fractured. Patriotism itself became a contested idea, for some a duty, for others a manipulation. Meanwhile, civil rights leaders pointed out the cruel inequality of the draft. White, wealthy young men found ways to avoid service. Poor, working class, and minority men had no such privilege. In cities across America, distrust of government grew into resentment. Resentment grew into rage. Rage grew into an identity. It wasn't just that America questioned the war, it questioned the nation it had believed itself to be. And at the center of that question were the soldiers, young men who fought in the jungle while their country fought about them. Some wrote letters begging their families not to argue. Others wondered if they were fighting for a nation that no longer wanted them. The battlefield in Vietnam was brutal, but the battlefield at home was existential. America didn't lose unity because of the war. America lost unity because the war forced it to confront itself. And that wound, deeper than any military loss, is the one the nation never fully healed. The soldiers America didn't welcome home. They left as boys and came home as something else, older, quieter, wounded in ways their families could not see, and their country did not understand. In previous wars, victory parades met returning troops. Bands played, crowds cheered, flags waved. Vietnam offered none of that. When soldiers stepped off the plane, there were no banners, no parades, no embraces from grateful strangers. Many returned in the darkness of early morning, flown in quietly to avoid protests. Some walked through airports in uniform only to be met with silence. Others were cursed at, insulted, spit on, treated not as survivors of a brutal war, but as symbols of a national mistake. America was angry at the war, but it took that anger out on the soldiers. They had fought in jungles where survival was a minute-to-minute negotiation. They had carried dying friends through mud. They had watched villages burn, received confusing orders, and faced an enemy that blended into the earth itself. They had done everything their country asked of them, and when they returned, their country looked away. The psychological wounds were immediate and devastating. Nightmares turned every bedroom into a battlefield. Fireworks sounded like ambushes. Backfiring cars sounded like mortar rounds. Crowded streets triggered panic. because crowds in Vietnam hid danger. Dark rooms and tight hallways felt like tunnels. But PTSD did not exist yet. Not as a diagnosis, not as a word, not as something society could acknowledge. Veterans were told to move on, be a man, get over it. They couldn't. Alcohol became a shield. Drugs became a refuge. Isolation became safer than connection. Some slept with guns under their pillows. Some slept not at all. The war followed them into marriages, friendships, workplaces. It followed them into their future. It followed them into the years no one talks about, the years where they sat alone in kitchens at 3 a.m., staring at nothing, reliving everything. Many hid their service entirely. They packed away uniforms and medals like guilty secrets. Some lied about having fought. Others lied about not having fought. The silence around Vietnam veterans became another battlefield, one where they fought alone. And the deepest wound? The belief that they had been abandoned not just by their government, but by the very people they thought they were protecting. Vietnam did not end when the soldiers came home. For them, it didn't end at all. The government that lost America's trust. Before Vietnam, Americans trusted their government in a way that feels almost impossible today. World War II had been clear. Korea had been contained. The presidency carried a moral authority that seemed unshakable. Vietnam shattered that foundation. For years, administrations insisted the war was progressing. Generals spoke of light at the end of the tunnel. Politicians promised that victory was close, that the enemy was almost defeated, that America just needed more time, more troops, more sacrifice. But behind the speeches, behind the press conferences, behind the patriotic slogans, the truth was darker. The Pentagon Papers, leaked in 1971 by Daniel Ellsberg, exposed decades of deception. They revealed that multiple presidents knew the war was unwinnable long before the public did. They exposed strategies that were never intended to succeed. They proved that casualty numbers had been manipulated, goals fabricated, progress exaggerated. For the first time in American history, millions of citizens realized their leaders had lied, not once, not twice, but systematically, intentionally, and repeatedly. Trust collapsed. Television showed senators grilling generals who had once been untouchable. Reporters openly challenged the White House. Young Americans began to see their government not as protector, but as perpetrator. Even the presidency, once seen as the conscience of the nation, became tainted by secrecy and contradiction. The phrase credibility gap entered the national vocabulary. It meant, we no longer believe what our leaders say. And after Vietnam, that belief never returned. The damage spread into every part of American society. Every future war was questioned. Every political decision was doubted. Every scandal felt like a continuation of the betrayal, not a deviation. Vietnam didn't just fracture trust in the government, it changed how Americans understood authority itself. A nation that once believed in its leaders, now believed in skepticism. A nation that once trusted the system, now interrogated it. A nation that once felt united beneath one flag, now held that flag with trembling hands, wondering what it truly meant. Vietnam broke more than military strategy. It broke America's faith in its own institutions. And that wound, like so many others from this war, never fully healed. The final flight from Saigon. By early 1975, the illusion of control was over. American troops were gone. Funding was drying up. South Vietnam was collapsing town by town, road by road, hour by hour. The North Vietnamese army advanced relentlessly, not as shadows in the jungle now, but as columns of tanks, artillery, and soldiers who had waited a decade for this moment. Saigon, the heart of South Vietnam, became a city of panic. Thousands of civilians crowded the U.S. embassy gates, clutching children, waving documents, begging for escape. Rumors spread like fire. The Americans will save us. The Americans have already left. The Americans won't leave until everyone is safe. The Americans will abandon us. All of them were wrong. All of them were right. Inside the embassy, Marines destroyed classified documents, burned files, smashed equipment. Every minute, the roar of the enemy grew closer. Every hour, the chaos intensified. Then the helicopters began to land. Operation Frequent Wind, the largest helicopter evacuation in history, unfolded in a surreal, frantic dance above the city. CH-46 and CH-53 helicopters touched down on rooftops and inside courtyards, blades whipping up dust and debris as lines of desperate people pressed forward. The iconic moment, the one the world still remembers, came when civilians climbed a stairway to a rooftop where a single helicopter waited. Men, women, children, even elderly parents stretched their arms upward, hoping for a miracle. Some made it aboard, others did not. For many Vietnamese, this was the end of everything: family, future, country. For many Americans, it was the most powerful symbol of defeat their nation had ever seen. As the last Marines guarded the embassy walls, they could hear explosions in the distance and gunfire echoing through the streets. Then came the final order: evacuate. The last helicopter lifted off at 7:53 a.m. on April 30, 1975. Marines on the roof watched as Saigon trembled beneath them, smoke rising, crowds surging, the South Vietnamese flag still fluttering for a few final hours. Some cried, some stared blankly, some whispered prayers, and when they left, they knew what the world would say: America had lost. Not a battle, not an objective, not a campaign, a war. The North Vietnamese tanks rolled into the presidential palace hours later. A soldier climbed atop a tank and raised the flag of the Viet Cong. The war was over. But the wound it left behind had only just begun. The wound that never healed. When the last helicopter blades stopped spinning, the war didn't end. It simply changed shape. It came home inside the minds of veterans, in the grief of families, in the emptiness of missing years. It lived in the arguments around kitchen tables, in political debates, in distrust, in silence. Vietnam became the war America could not talk about, because talking about it required admitting something deeper than defeat, that the nation had broken in ways it did not know how to repair. The veterans carried invisible scars. The families carried unanswered questions. The politicians carried quiet guilt. The nation carried humiliation disguised as anger. Vietnam reshaped everything that came after. It changed American foreign policy. It changed how wars are fought. It changed media, politics, protests, the presidency, public trust. It changed the way soldiers were treated in every conflict that followed. It created skepticism as a national identity, patriotism as a question mark, leadership as something to interrogate, not assume. For many veterans, healing never came. They returned to a country that didn't understand them, didn't want to hear them, didn't know how to help them. Nightmares stalked them. Memories tortured them. Guilt became a shadow that followed them through decades. Some found solace in each other. Some found solace in silence. Some never found it at all. For the nation, healing was just as incomplete. The bitter divisions between young and old, rich and poor, hawk and dove, left cracks in the national foundation that never closed. Wars before Vietnam united America. Wars after Vietnam divided it. That is Vietnam's legacy. The war did not destroy the United States, but it fractured it, bent it, shook its confidence, made it question its own moral compass, turned trust into skepticism, and idealism into caution. America recovered economically. It recovered militarily. But emotionally, spiritually, psychologically, America never recovered from this war, because Vietnam wasn't just a conflict, it was a mirror. And what America saw in that mirror changed the nation forever.